Well, good morning. Here we are from Lewes in East Sussex, broadcasting to the world. Already, I've had somebody on the far coast of British Columbia interested in our guest this morning. Her son is one of the top civil servants in the British Columbia government, so perhaps a few secrets are going to be passed on. But my guest this morning is Professor David Omund, the former chief spy for the UK. I haven't spoken to him other than 2 minutes before this broadcast, so anything he says is totally fresh, and any question I ask is as daft as they normally are. But let me introduce you first, and good morning, Professor. Oh, hang on, I hit the wrong thing there. There we go.
Yep.
There we go. Professor Sir David Omund, who is going to give a lot of secrets away at this year's Lewes Speakers Festival, which takes place tomorrow and Sunday. And you're appearing tomorrow, I believe, Sir David.
Yes, good morning, Keith. It's a new experience for me to appear on Mirador television. Yes, I'll be down in Lewes tomorrow talking about my new book, or it's just out in Penguin paperback, How Spies Think. I don't want to mislead the audience to think that this is going to be a stream of secrets that haven't been told before. Some of them have indeed been told before, but I want to interpret them and refresh memories and perhaps tell people a few stories they haven't heard before.
Well, I think that's a very good stance, because when United Press International was at its height, as a news network, it used to tell its journalists, tell them, remind them that you've told them, and then remind them that you reminded them, because people really don't retain stuff. So all your stories, even if they've been heard before, I'm sure will be fresh to a lot of people.
I remember
I would like to, sorry, yes.
I was going to say that that was the teaching mantra in all military education. I remember, which was, teach them again, and then tell them at the end what you've told them.
Perhaps the British Army either owned UPI or UPI owned the British Army, one way or another. But I would like to say I don't know whether you can tell how a good spy is a good spy, because many years ago, my late wife, who is a Canadian, and I met in Vancouver, and whom I courted for a little while. And when I proposed marriage, she said, well, first of all, I have to ask your advice. She said, I'm a spy, and I really want to know whether you would expect me to give that up. And she told me that she gave it up. But I'm not so sure that for 40 years I had a spy who loved me.
Well,
now, perhaps I could ask you a few questions, because first of all, we think in terms of secrecy for the sort of work that you did, and yet your headquarters is on the south bank of the Thames. It's a big building and in plain sight.
Well, that's one of the headquarters, not of the service I led. I led Gchq down in Cheltenham, the now sitting in the famous donut. And just to cap your story, when I was appointed director, it was reported in the newspapers that I'd taken up this job of director of Gchq, the Signals Intelligence Agency. And my aunt, living up in Glasgow, wrote to me saying, I think I can tell you now where I spent the war, which was at Bletchley Park. And they had so impressed them. She was a Wren officer, a German speaker, so they brought her in. They so impressed secrecy that she told no one in the family what she had been doing during the war, other than she was in England on war work. And she then dug out her certificate and little medal they all got presented with at the end of the war. So I thought that just shows what you can do in terms of secrecy.
And did you impose that sort of discipline on the people that work for you?
No, because the world has changed. And one of the big changes is that if you're going to run intelligence operations, which I think a nation like the United Kingdom needs to inform the decisions that our ministers need to take. If you're going to do that, you need the support of the public. And actually, you're spending a certain amount of public money on it. And sometimes it gets into ethically quite dubious waters. And you've got to be able to be sure that, you know, Parliament is behind you, and you do operate within the domestic law. So we talk about these things now in general terms in a way that was never the case before. Actually, I think it's a great advantage, because if you're trying to recruit some young person, you don't want to be the position I was in when I got recruited, which is you mustn't tell your family what you're going to do. So, you know, here's this cover story about carrying out research into communications, and that's what you tell them you're going to be doing. So I accepted the job as a very young man, a cadet at Gchq, without even really knowing what they did. Now, it's much easier to recruit people these days when you can put an advertisement for some cyber expertise. You know, we want, you know, on the internet.
But you did point out to me a flaw in the Fleming novels.
Yes, indeed. I mean, there is this distinction which the newspapers choose not to observe between the intelligence officer, who's a crown servant employed by the United Kingdom, and the agent. And the secret agent is the person they have recruited to help them by providing information. But it's the intelligence officers. And I think James Bond would have made a very bad intelligence officer, because he goes around the world staying at 5-star hotels, signing in with his own name, which is a little bit of a giveaway. His job essentially was to disrupt threats to the United Kingdom, which, according to the movies, great movies, he did extremely well and very bravely. But he wasn't gathering secret intelligence. The person you want out there would be unobtrusive. Nobody would notice when they walk into a room, the opposite, as it were, of the charismatic Daniel Craig.
Now, you said that there's almost nothing new in your business and what you've revealed. So forgive me if I ask the question that everybody asks you, but do 007s exist?
No, British 007s certainly don't exist. It's not a very... a license to kill is not something in peacetime that would ever be given by a British government. Other countries, of course, do have assassins. The inhabitants of Salisbury, the peaceful town of Salisbury, discovered this when Russian military intelligence assassins turned up with a prohibited nerve agent to try and kill Colonel Skripal and his daughter. So other countries certainly use assassination as a tool. We don't. Number of reasons for that. One is a distaste for that kind of activity in peacetime. I think war, when you're at war, is different. And partly it's amongst intelligence agencies, you know, with that exception of the Russian services, you don't go around bumping off because other people will do it to you.
Retaliation, indeed. I mean, the one case that I remember that brought these sort of things to attention was the Bulgarian umbrella man who stabbed a diplomat on London Bridge, I think it was, or Tower Bridge, was it?
Gregory Markov. And that was very unusual before my time, or back in the 50s, but a very unusual piece of skullduggery. It wasn't the practice amongst the Cold War agencies to conduct that sort of activity.
So it took you by surprise, or well, not you, because you weren't there at the time, but that sort of thing would have taken our own intelligence service by surprise.
Yes, I'm sure the security service had no idea that such. And the other extraordinary thing is the method. I mean, if you We do know that there are criminal assassins. You can hire someone to conduct an assassination, and the most common method would simply be walking up to somebody in a quiet street with a gun. The idea of shooting a poisoned dart out of an umbrella, and all the things that could go wrong with such an operation.
Well, actually, sometimes we get the impression, particularly if you talk to people slightly behind the scenes, there's a recent case of the body in the bag, and it sounded as if Inspector Clouseau had been in charge of that, because they zipped some sort of stuff inside the bag that could only be put in if the bag was open when the body had gone in. You remember the case I'm talking about?
I don't remember that one. But...
Right. Well, it's fairly recent, about 2-3 years ago. But one of the things that I think that you were talking about other countries, and indeed Salisbury, and not to put too fine a point on it, the Russians. A lot of people don't forgive me for this, but I helped set up Russia Today television way back in 2005, and I got to know a lot of Russians, and I got the feeling that even if President Putin used underhanded methods, that the average citizen in Moscow was perfectly okay with it. The Russian government doesn't have to actually get people on side, as indeed you suggest our intelligence service has to.
I think that's probably right. There is a very long tradition which has been inherited from the Cold War Soviet Union, and the Russian agencies have simply continued with the kind of operations which the Soviet Union used to conduct, which is sad. The Putin regime at the moment, of course, is in the spotlight as to whether or not they're going to commit an enormous aggression against an independent state, Ukraine.
Let me just ask you, coming closer to home, because actually I've been a bit of a gypsy, and I spent a long time in Northern Ireland, and I was there from 1975 onwards, in the height of the Troubles. So I did actually I poked my head above the parapet, and I did a program called Police 6, which was a takeoff on Shaw Taylor's Police 5, except it was 6 minutes long. So I did get to know the army and the police quite well. But were there intelligence officers, in the sense of people working for you, operative in Northern Ireland? And are there still?
The main weight is taken now by the police service of Northern Ireland, and it's supported, and this is openly known, by the security service MI5, which has it's worked on the Irish problem for a very, very long time. The other agencies, the Secret Service, Vauxhall Cross, and my old agency, Gchq, provide supporting intelligence as and when they have that kind of intelligence to provide. The objective is to keep the people of Northern Ireland safe, particularly, of course, from the dissident Republican groups who are still wanting to continue the fight. But they are now in such a minority in Northern Ireland. I think it is a great triumph of the successive British governments to work away patiently, backed up by some high-grade intelligence, to arrive at a peace process and then finally at a settlement.
All right. Now, I've asked you the questions that were close to my heart. You're here to give a lecture tomorrow. First of all, tell us when you're appearing. We know that it's at the All Saints Centre, but what time? How long is your lecture, and is it question and answer?
It's I've been invited to give a talk about the book, which I shall do, and then there'll be an open question and answer, and I'm quite prepared to field questions from any part of the defense, security, and intelligence world. But there are things you can't talk about, and I won't. But my background, I hasten to say, has been in that part of the intelligence world, which is these days about acquiring digital intelligence, about who is communicating with whom and where and when, particularly to support, nowadays it's to support counterterrorism, counter-criminality, dealing with cyber attacks and so on.
But it is, I mean, one of the things that I was warned about is that the probos, first of all, their tentacles are very extensive. They know exactly who's who. I don't know whether the name Frank Delaney means anything to you.
It does,
an author,
yes.
And a producer of I think, of a history of Ireland. He was a good friend, and when I first went to Belfast, I said to Frank, you know, I've been threatened in the UK. Am I in any danger? And he said, well, I'm off to Dublin this weekend. I'll find out. And on the Monday morning, he came back, and with a big grin, he said, do you want the good news or the bad news? And I said, whichever way round. He said, well, first of all, you're on the list, but you're number 1,000. But one of the things that I would ask you is whether you're covert or overt. Is the various terror groups would know about you. How secure do you feel, particularly coming into the public light, now that you're back as a professor and not involved in intelligence work?
My career, which was a full career in the civil service, you know, I worked in the Ministry of Defence. I was permanent secretary of the Home Office, dealing with all the issues there, and then security and intelligence coordinator, as well as being director of Gchq. I've had a full career in that world. I'm not I haven't spent my time undercover. I say my part of the intelligence world, it was the technical part rather than that of the secret agents. So I make no pretense to that. But in my final job, I was coordinating the activities of the different agencies and ensuring they work together. If you read the Le Carre style of fiction, quite often there's kind of rivalry between services. That, in a sense, was the case in the old days. But these days, and it's particularly since the events of 9/11 and the terrorist threat to the public, the British agencies and the police service, particularly the Metropolitan Police, have worked so closely together to try and uncover and deal with those threats. And today it's the same with the cyber world, where the number of, this is where criminality has moved. Why bother to try and hold up a bank with a shotgun when you can steal the same amount of money from the other side of the world? And they do. And if you got caught with your shotgun and the balaclava, you would get a long prison sentence for the threat you pose to the public. Now you can, if you're sitting somewhere on the other side of the world, hacking in or sending out material which is fraudulent, conning people into giving over their life savings or whatever, or ransomware, locking up their computers of companies or health bodies, and then demanding a ransom to unlock the data. That sort of activity. It's white collar crime. You're very unlikely to be caught, but if you are, it's not the same as the violence that was implicit in the, if you like, old-fashioned armed robbery. So that's where criminals have moved, and it's combating that kind of activity is now a major function of the intelligence services as well as the police.
Let me ask you this, though. East Sussex Police spend a lot of time and a lot of money on cybercrime. But in a place like Lewis, because we no longer have the coppers on the beat, is the minor criminal starts to have a field day. Now, could that be applied to your world, that in fact you're so concentrated on cybercrime that the old-fashioned spy is busily rubbing his hands saying they don't know anything about me?
Well, you have to prioritize. There are always these tough choices to be made with limited resources. There has been an argument in the last couple of years that the intelligence community and police have spent too much effort on trying to counter terrorism instead of keeping an eye on Russia. That's rather unfair, because certainly Russia's always been and will continue to be an object of attention. But there is obviously a risk. But can you allow something like ransomware to continue? Because what is happening, it's the smaller and medium-sized company wake up to discover that their crucial machinery no longer works, or their data is locked up, or if you're a medical clinic, that all the X-ray material, all of that is inaccessible without paying quite a small ransom. And these criminals keep the ransom quite small so that it's affordable. And that's a difficult position. I mean, there's plenty of advice around about how to back up the data and how to organize yourself. But so big companies are perhaps harder targets, but it's the small and medium-sized enterprises. A crucial part of my old organization, Gchq, is the National Cybersecurity Centre, just next to Victoria Station in London. And they've got a wonderful website with lots of advice on how you can actually, in simple, practical terms, keep yourself safer.
Now, this program isn't. I hope that what we have this morning is a lovely chat, so that people find out a little bit more about you, about your book, about your work, and so on. However, amongst my other gypsy activities, I worked for a short while in Lugansk in the Ukraine, in the eastern part of Ukraine, which actually is quite different to the western part, and it borders the Russian Federation. I think Lugansk is about 12 miles from the border. And that's where the problem at the moment is building. Do you see what's happening as a real threat, or is it a saber rattling by Mr. Putin?
It's a very real threat to Ukraine and to its independence. I mean, as far as we know, the Russian authorities mount very regular cyber attacks on Ukraine. They shut down the lights, the electricity supply to Kiev, for example. They launched an attack through some accounting software which Ukrainian companies used, which then caused enormous damage, the so-called NotPetya attack. So they've been putting real pressure on Ukraine now for quite a long time. It's not saber rattling. It's trying to get what President Putin wants, which is Ukraine to be legally made a neutral country that cannot join NATO, cannot join the European Union. Now, there's no, I think, foreseeable prospect of Ukraine joining NATO. And everyone knows that. But President Putin has expressed his demands in maximalist terms, in the sort of terms that the United States and NATO nations really can't agree to. So it is a genuine crisis. And what would be my degree of surprise if Russian troops did cross, certainly into the Donbass region, for example? I would not be that surprised. But can they be deterred? Well, yes, this is where the spelling out in advance what the penalties would be for a Russia that invades an independent state. And it's part of trying to unwind the settlement at the end of the Cold War, when Ukraine became an independent nation, no longer part of the Soviet Union. But it's not part of NATO. We're not under a security obligation to fight for Ukraine. But it would be very serious for peace in the world to see an independent state just invaded in that way. And the precedent of Crimea is there, where that was essentially a Russian takeover.
Yes. Now, I'm grateful for you responding to some of my questions. I say I don't expect any of them were original, but let's turn to why you're coming to Lewes tomorrow. And basically it says you're going to give 10 lessons on how real spies think. So can I turn this over to you now? This is your time to tell us how real spies think. And if in fact my late wife had been here, she'd have been delighted to see whether you could have got into her mind, I'm sure.
Well, I'm not going to go through 10 lessons, that would take too long. But one of the reasons for writing the book is because those lessons apply to all of us when we come to take a decision. And there are ways in which you can think about the problem that's in front of you. It might be moving house, acquiring a new life partner, who knows what it is, buying a new car. There are ways in which you can approach that kind of decision objectively, analytically, which will produce sounder decisions. And the first lesson is always to remember that your knowledge of the world is fragmentary, it's incomplete, and it's sometimes wrong. And if you go around thinking that you know it all, that you have all the information you need, you are going to be badly surprised from time to time, because there will be surprises. But what I set out in the book is a way in which you can think about, what do I need to know to take a really sound decision about something that really affects my life? And the first, I put it in an acronym, SEES, which spells out C's, which is what a good officer should be doing. And the first S is situational awareness. What, where, when, who? What is actually going on? What is the situation? If it's a personal decision, what position am I in? What does my bank account really look like? All those sort of what questions. And that's the first stage. And you can get some of that wrong. You can look in the wrong place. You can overlook things. This is part of intelligence analysis. Then if you've got that, the next stage is to explain. And this is quite tough because it may involve a certain amount of soul searching. I get into this position. What's motivating my wish to take this decision? Is it to gain some advantage? For example, why do I want to move out of the town into the countryside? It's a romantic notion. Have I really worked out what's going to be involved? And particularly in the intelligence world, beginning to read the motivations of someone else. We were talking about this a second ago. What really is motivating President Putin in Moscow? So you have some explanations. If you've got the data, you've got the explanation, then you begin to get into the estimation of what might happen next. If I were to do this, how's it likely to turn out? And then you can model. You can say, well, using my explanations, if I were to move not into the countryside, but into a smaller town or whatever, what would then be the outcome? If we were to threaten President Putin with financial sanctions, or not starting his famous gas pipeline, what would be the outcome? And that's really what the ministers really want, is that estimative intelligence. And then that's the E for estimates in the word C's. And then the final one, the final S, is working backwards from the future to the present. So you think ahead 5 years and then you work back to now. So you're saying to yourself, well, if this was to be the outcome in 5 years' time, what could I do now, perhaps to avoid that situation in future, or to take advantage of the opportunity. So you're thinking ahead. And if you look 5 or 10 years ahead, there are an awful lot of problems. Climate change beginning to really affect us, for example. But then you can work forward and you can say, well, if that's what I'm seeing in the future and I don't like it, I could do things now which would make it less likely. And those are those four components: the knowing what's going on now, the situational awareness, the explanation of the motivations of the people involved, the estimation of how things might turn out, and then finally, what can I do today to make it less likely that some of these future things, which I don't like, will come about. Put those together, and you've got a method for approaching it. Because when you think about it, if you've got a big decision to take, it doesn't matter if you're the prime minister or foreign minister or a general, or when you've got a big decision to take, there are two different kinds of thinking you have to hold together in your mind. One is emotional. What do I want? What are my desires? What am I trying to avoid? Very much couched by, your feelings and your emotions. And the other is rational. It's very much more fact-based analysis of the kind I've just been describing. And the unfortunate person who has to make the decision, you or me or the Prime Minister, has to bring those two together. If it's all emotion, then goodness me, you're going to get into a mess. If it's too rational, then you're going to miss important parts of, what makes us tick as human beings, what's, drives us to do things. So you've got to bring the two together. Now, one of the themes of my book, and I'll be talking about this tomorrow, is the impact that social media has on the way we think. And it's all become much too emotional. And social media is a wonderful thing. It connects us together. What would we have done during the pandemic if we hadn't been able to have social media? But it has a big downside, which is that the information we think we're relying on very often is not reliable. And these conspiracies spread, disinformation spreads, and then people take advantage of that. Our Russian friends are very good at spreading disinformation, and they interfered with the American elections, particularly in 2016. They interfered with the French presidential election last time, even tiny little bit of trying to influence our election last time around. So you've got to keep an eye open for deception. The intelligent people, world of intelligence analysts, they are well aware of that and they're used to it. But I think we've all now got to be a bit more skeptical about some of the claims which fall into our inboxes when we go on social media.
Now, those are very good insights, and you started to hit little pings in my mind. And one of the things I would like to ask you, because I've been also a trainer and a teacher of journalists for a good many years of my life, apart from being a journalist itself. When people came and joined your organization, how did you decide that you were going to let them know the features, if you like, in essence, the way that you're looking for them to operate? Did you do that at interview stage, or did you have classes, or how did you actually say, here is a raw recruit, now we want them to behave and think in a certain way? What did you do?
Well, it starts with the recruitment process and screening out people who are probably not best suited to that kind of work. Just to give you one example, if you're working in any part of the intelligence or security community, you are essentially operating behind the scenes. So if your personality type is one that desperately needs public approbation and very much a stage presence, then it's probably not the work for you. So the one thing in the secret world you don't want are people who don't have a moral compass. You have to steal secrets in one way or another, technically or in human terms. So it's not quite the 10 Commandments. You are stealing somebody else's secrets, or you're manipulating somebody to encourage them to help you. So you need somebody who knows what they're doing. They're conscious, and therefore they can say, is it really necessary to do this? Is this proportionate to what I hope to get out of it? So ethical concerns. What you really don't want is a loose cannon who really can't distinguish right from wrong, and therefore they are going to get you into quite a lot of trouble later on. And it's not so different from the armed services, where you are equipping people with lethal weapons, you're sending them out into some hostile environment, yet we are expecting them to behave decently and to respect the humanity of other people. They have a job to do, they have a mission to succeed in, but they also have duties to protect innocent civilians on the battlefield, for example. And what you don't want are people who are rogue. So that's part of the selection process. It's part of the early training and encouraging discussion of these issues. What should you do if you found yourself in this sort of position? What are the limits in accessing the private information of your suspects if you're engaged, for example, in counter-terrorist work? So these are serious issues, and discussion of these is encouraged. The intelligence agencies have ethics counselors who, staff can go to if they feel, hang on, I'm not sure I should be asked to do that. And they can talk it through. And it's all done in the UK under domestic law. I mean, Parliament has passed laws governing all this activity.
Right. Now, I would never make a good spy because, first of all, I don't know whether you saw the little intro, the mouth that roared. I can't keep a secret to save my life. And not only that, but I broadcast it and analyze it and do probably emotional analysis, although I like to pretend that I'm doing it on the basis of knowledge. But if somebody like me knocks on the door, and indeed there has been sort of an invitation, come and join Gchq, be a recruit. If somebody like me knocks on the door, how do you know that let's not invest any time or money in this chap because he's not likely to keep a secret? I mean, how do you sort out the wheat from the chaff, as it were?
Well, it's you're never going to get it entirely right. I've given you a couple of examples of things you would kind of look out for in personality type. If you're recruiting for GCHQ, you're also looking for particular kinds of mind, problem-solving minds. The famous story during the Second World War of the Times crossword puzzle competition, where successive editions, and then anyone who you wrote in with the solution, and anyone who got all the answers right got an invitation to an interview. It's that crossword puzzle solving mind. I don't know, Keith, if you've seen, but the cryptanalysts at GCHQ and the problem solvers have actually published, Penguin have published, the GCHQ puzzle book. And there are now 2 volumes of this that contain puzzles, and they're ferociously difficult. They give the answers at the back of the book, I'm pleased to say. So I haven't been completely stumped. But they include in those volumes some of the questions they set in the examination that they make their potential recruits sit. So I had to sit this examination. It was much the hardest exam I've ever sat in my life. Much harder than university exams. Didn't require prior knowledge, but it did require an ability to get stuck in to thinking through some problems. And you can buy the puzzle book. The proceeds go to charity, and try it. And then you might decide, perhaps, is this the, you'd have to then say, how much would I enjoy day in, day out, solving puzzles? And for a lot of people, it is absolute, it's a world they love.
Well, I think I have a candidate for you, because there is a pub in Lewes called the Brewers. It's a free house, so I'm not sort of taking favourites. And several journalists would gather at the bar and try to do various crossword puzzles. And quite often what we did was we took a word, as long as it's got the right number of letters, we filled in the gaps. But the owner, well, joint owner, is a lady of some 35, 36. I think she's taking an open university degree right now, and she would come along and sort us all out. So I think there's a candidate there.
But your story also illustrates that this sort of work is a team sport, and that actually if you've got sparky individuals, you get to the answer faster.
Indeed. Okay, what I'm going to do for the moment, because we've been talking now for 41 minutes, and I've enjoyed every moment of it, and I'm quite sure our viewers have too. What I would like to do is perhaps just show you. I don't know whether you know Lewes, but there is one very famous park and building, and I'm just going to show it for everybody, just so that we can take a breath. That mansion is quite interesting, because first of all, it was built with the stone from our priory here, which was pulled down by Henry VIII, or at least Thomas Cromwell, at the dissolution of the monasteries, but also a family there known as the Newtons, who were Puritans. And during the English Civil War, the royalists in the western part of England tried to get a presence in the eastern part, and in those days Lewes was the main town, and they set out to get the Newtons and to attack Lewes and that particular house, and were met at Haywards Heath, which most people now think about just getting on and off the train. But there is a battle of Haywards Heath, and an armed force of Cromwellians from Lewes went and met the royalists, and there was a battle, and the Cromwellians won, and the royalists packed their bags and went back to Chichester. So history was made. So that, if you haven't been to Lewes before, that's one of the places that is key to our history. Now, we've got another 15 minutes or so, and if you're able to stay with us just for a minute or two more, I'd be grateful, because everything that you've said has been absolutely fascinating. But one or two more things that I wanted to ask. One is, for instance, Noel Coward was probably the most famous case, where he kept on saying to Churchill, "I want to spy for Britain." Do you still have celebrities and so on who travel the world, and therefore would go to places where even covert spies couldn't go, come and knock on the door and say, "I'd love to spy for you"?
I think that's part of an older world. I'm not sure today's world is quite the same, but I'm sure the today's intelligence agencies welcome offers of support from every quarter. And would apply their imagination as to how a patriotic figure might help them in one way or another. The help might well be indirect rather than thinking you're going to acquire secret intelligence these days.
All right, Sir David Almond, as a spy of the past, and now a writer, an author, and a lecturer, but the professor part, which is up on the screen that we haven't mentioned, what about your life now?
Well, when I retired, I needed a base, as it were, and I've always had an inclination that the academic world would be very interesting and I could contribute too. So I joined the War Studies department at King's College in London, very famous department, and I've been helping to teach, lecture to the master's students, helping run a course in intelligence studies. It's a fascinating world, and that's enabled me to write about the subject, write about the ethics of intelligence, for example, write about counterterrorism and the limits of what civilized nations should do in trying to defeat terrorism. So it's been fascinating. And what's wonderful is that the students keep you alive. They're young, they're enthusiastic. They don't necessarily, in fact, they don't always agree with what I'm presenting. And that's one of the joys of academic life, is you get this interplay. And they're the future. That's the young generation, next generation we're teaching. A lot of them, there are over, must be about 200 master students who are interested in intelligence, often from a scholarly point of view. What difference did it really make in the past, during the war, during the Cold War? The documents are now gradually appearing in the archives of the world. So it is possible to research the real truth of what happened about X or Y. It's a fascinating area. And we begin to realize that this was, as Professor Christopher Andrew at Cambridge University called it, the missing dimension of history, that an awful lot of history was written without knowing that behind the scenes, particularly military history, some information, generals had information. And of course, it's only relatively recently that has really come to light. So to give you one example, Canadian Professor John Ferris, a very well-known scholar, has just published an authorized history of my old organization, Gchq. So tracing the code breaking, for example, from the earliest days. Gchq is now just over 100 years old as a British intelligence institution. So it's formed after the First World War, when the Navy and the Air Force cryptographers came together and they created a national organization. That's 100 years ago. Extraordinary tradition. And we're still very good at it. But now, as I was saying before the break, now, of course, they're facing the cyber world, the digital world. A lot of criminals and hostile states attacking us through cyberspace. One of the biggest attacks, for example, the Russian attack on Ukraine using malware, virus, escaped, and it started to infect major companies around the world. And the overall cost, would you believe how much that $10 billion worth of damage was done to private companies by this malware, infecting all their equipment and having to throw it away, start again. That is the scale of the problem that's being created, and why we need to put a huge effort into digital security. make sure we can, trade and buy things online. We can communicate securely.
Now, obviously, I responded to myself thinking, right, he's trying to turn out ethical spies. But, but you did say, really, that part of your work is putting things into context. So looking at some of the famous cases, Gary Powers springs to mind, for instance, but looking at all the famous cases, is there one that you say, gosh, yes, that's something that is more intriguing than anything else that's gone on, something that you would perhaps at a dinner party relate because of your interest?
I think I would pick the extraordinary case of Oleg Gordievsky, who was colonel in the KGB. He was posted as a foreign posting to Copenhagen. The Danish authorities, security authorities, picked up on him and thought, this is a spook. They got interested in him. They contacted our own secret service, SIS, MI6, who helped them recruit Gordievsky and to run him. And eventually, it's a well-known story, but eventually he gets posted to London and eventually becomes the acting head of the KGB station in the Soviet embassy in London, all the time then being run by MI6. And what the extraordinary sort of culmination of this, which is why I find it such a fascinating story, is that this is the moment when the Moscow is beginning to think about changing from geriatric old leaders to new, and Gorbachev, Mikhail Gorbachev, is the KGB's pick for the next Soviet leader. And so Gordievsky tips off the British. Margaret Thatcher is prime minister. She invites Gorbachev for his first big overseas visit to London. He accepts. And you have this extraordinary situation where she is sitting down for her discussions. She has a brief in front of, she's been well briefed, including material provided by Gordievsky from inside. Gorbachev also has a brief, and it also contains material provided. No wonder this meeting was a great success. And Margaret Thatcher afterwards said, this is a man I can do business with. And this was all shared with the United States, President Reagan, after Gordievsky he was, in fact, they began to suspect him. So he moved to the UK, but he visited Reagan a couple of times and was very influential in giving President Reagan a much better understanding of what was actually happening. And that this was not the evil empire that Reagan had tended to talk about, but you could actually do arms control deals. And that then led on, of course, to some of the big breakthroughs in cooling the Cold War right down towards the end of the Soviet era.
That's fascinating. I remember a movie called Double Cross, I think, in which during the war there was a man who was held in the Isle of Wight prison and was working for the Germans and for us and for them, and nobody ever knew in the end who he really was working for.
No, that again, the double cross system is probably the most successful deception operation of all time, because the security service MI5 had managed to uncover every single German agent that was sent into the UK during the early part of the war. And they were offered the choice, cooperate with us or face execution in the Tower of London as a spy. Most of them agreed to cooperate, and they then were used as channels to feed disinformation back to the German high command. And of course, this really came into its own with the Normandy landings in 1944. A huge deception operation. So their agents were feeding them back stories about a whole American Army Corps, enormous unit in the Dover area, which was being prepared for invasion across the Straits of Dover. And of course, when the Normandy landings took place in Normandy, the high command in Germany still thought that the main invasion was going to take place when a whole corps arrived across the Straits of Dover. So they held back a whole panzer division to block that attack. Now, had that panzer division been deployed into Normandy, then those landings might very well not have succeeded in the way they did. And they were bloody affairs as it was. So, the whole history of Europe sort of hangs there on you can just imagine it's counterfactual thinking. But suppose those landings in Normandy had not been wholly successful. And suppose they'd got trapped in a sort of enclave without being able to break out through France. The Red Army on the other side of Europe would then have been advancing, and they'd have advanced beyond Berlin. So we wouldn't have had a West Germany. We wouldn't have the structure of Europe that we have today. So a lot of things hang on the success of 1944 and the double-cross system, the extraordinary work done turning these agents and running them over a period of years, feeding back disinformation, is an important part of that jigsaw. That's the kind of story that the students that I'm teaching at King's College, they study, they look at. It's difficult to think that today you could carry out anything on that scale. One of the great advantages in those days was that Bletchley Park, which I mentioned earlier, doing the decryption, they could read the German Enigma machines. So they could actually read the communications of the German Secret Service. And therefore, they knew that the deception was working. Deception is very dangerous, because if you're trying to persuade somebody that what they know actually fits a different narrative from the truth, if they think you are deceiving them, then you're actually giving away the real secret. So you've got to be very careful that your deception actually works. And of course, by reading the German High Command's messages, that gave the London a high degree of confidence that all this deception was actually working.
Bletchley Park, a fascinating story. Now, believe it or not, we've been talking for 58 minutes.
I shall have to disappear.
55.
I shall have to disappear at this stage.
We have to say goodbye in 2 minutes' time, but I always give my guests a chance to talk about anything that they want, whether it's baking tarts or whether you, like me, play with model trains or whatever. So here's your 60 seconds of freedom to speak about whatever you want.
No, I want to speak about the message I'll be giving tomorrow in Lewis when I talk about my book, which is don't let the emotional side of the argument predominate. Think through and be skeptical about what you read on social media and the material that gets fed to you on social media, because it's designed by the machines. It's selected by the machines to be material that's going to be attractive to you. So don't be seduced by it.
Well, you've kept me on the straight and narrow this morning. Absolutely fascinating, and thank you for joining us. And I'm sure that you will get a large crowd tomorrow at the All Saints Centre. Fascinating it is. And I could have gone on for another hour, but it's 9 o'clock now. Yeah. And the discipline is that we have to say goodbye. thank you very much indeed for coming on. And I hope that perhaps I can lure you back at some time in the future, because I think there's probably another hour's worth there at least for you to relate. Thanks, Professor.
Very good. Okay. Great to talk, Keith. Thanks.
Bye. Right. No, they can't remove me from stream. They call me Mr. Keith. Never mind. We're supposed to. There we go. Yeah. A fascinating morning talking spy stuff. And if you want to go and hear Professor Almond tomorrow, it's at the Speakers Festival, the All Saints Centre, and he's on at 5:20. And lots of other good speakers, including Norman Baker. But you have to pick and choose, I guess. That's one of them. Thank you for being with us this morning. I have to say goodbye now. I haven't given you any of the information except to say it was started out as -2. It's going to reach about 6. Skies, scattered cloud, a very light breeze, and all in all, not a bad day. For the moment, then, let's say, well, what the hell? Let's say still a Happy New Year, because it's still only the middle of January, about. Toodle pip. Bye-bye.